The first time I saw a face staring at me through the submersible window, we were nearly 7 miles down and absolutely nothing should have been alive out there. I remember freezing so hard my fingers slipped off the controls, because I knew even before the light steadied that I had just broken one of the 11 rules they warned me about. They never listed them all at once, just whispered pieces during training, always with that same uneasy look, like they were hoping I'd quit before learning why the rules existed. I didn't quit. I should have. Especially after the night I broke another rule and something answered. I kept my hands hovering over the console, still shaken from what I thought I saw outside the window, and tried to steady my breathing as the emergency lights dimmed back into their usual dull blue haze. The sensation of being watched didn't fade, even though the sonar claimed there was nothing out there except our own drifting wake. And that made me remember the warning that had been drilled into us from day one. Rule 1. Never look directly at the windows for more than 3 seconds at a time. They made us repeat it during training, as if it were some kind of prayer, and I caught myself mumbling Rule 1. Never look directly at the windows for more than 3 seconds at a time, again as I forced my eyes down toward the navigation board, pretending I wasn't dying to look up again. The submersible rocked gently, though not enough to suggest any real movement, and I tried convincing myself that the pressure of the trench was playing tricks on my head. I'd heard senior pilots talk about how the human brain wasn't built for this kind of darkness, that the black outside could feel alive if you stared at it too long, but I never understood why they said it with that same uneasy shift in their voice. They never wanted to explain the details, and they never answered questions, so I learned to stop asking. Still, sitting there with the distant navigation beacons flickering like faint stars thousands of feet above us, I felt the cabin tighten around me as if the metal itself was holding its breath. Every instinct told me to check the window again, but the rule hung in my mind like a hand gripping the back of my neck. I forced myself to focus on the depth gauge instead, watching the numbers inch upward as we continued drifting along the trench wall. The Mariana Trench wasn't a place for hesitation, especially not inside a sub the size of a small truck, and any lapse in attention could end in crushing pressure or a dead engine. Yet none of those dangers frightened me as much as whatever had stared back at me earlier. I tried convincing myself it was my reflection, distorted by stress and the shimmering particles swirling outside, but even repeating that excuse didn't make the feeling of being watched disappear. I had to check the instruments again, one by one, telling myself that as long as everything stayed in the green, nothing could go wrong. But something about the quiet bothered me, as if the sub itself was waiting for a reaction. Marcus, my partner on this rotation, finally broke the silence by asking if I was going to keep staring at the gauges all night. I didn't want to admit what I thought I'd seen, so I just told him I was recalibrating the alignment after the brief power flicker. He shrugged like he didn't care, but he leaned forward slightly as if trying to peer out the window beside me. I instinctively put a hand on his shoulder before he could, telling him to stop, and he gave me a confused look that lasted a little too long for comfort. I couldn't tell him why I reacted that way without sounding paranoid, and even if I did, he'd probably laugh. He was one of those people who never took the rules seriously, and I wasn't ready for him to start testing them out of curiosity. The drifting continued for another few minutes, and I hoped the encounter had been nothing more than exhaustion. Down here, sleep never felt refreshing. It felt like pausing your fear for a few hours before waking up with it pressed against your face again. Marcus fiddled with the diagnostics panel, humming a tune that made the silence almost bearable, but every few moments he'd glance toward the window behind me like he was trying to see whether I'd react again. I kept pretending not to notice. If I acknowledged it, he'd start asking questions, and if he asked questions, he might try proving the rules were just superstitions. I wasn't about to let him tempt something I didn't understand. I eventually had to adjust our course, which meant glancing up toward the forward viewport, and that brief movement sent a chill down my spine. I forced myself to follow the rule, letting my eyes pass across the window in barely more than a quick sweep before looking away. Marcus noticed my stiffness and commented that it looked like I'd seen a ghost. I didn't respond, partly because I was embarrassed and partly because I didn't trust my voice not to shake. Instead, I kept adjusting the sub's thrusters, nudging us away from a jagged ridge that rose like a massive spine out of the ocean floor. I hated how that ridge seemed to lean toward us, as though it were trying to listen. The cabin lights flickered again, softer this time, but enough for Marcus to look up from the controls. He made a joke about how everything on this sub was older than we were, but I didn't laugh. The flicker was too familiar, too synchronized with what happened earlier. I didn't tell him that the lights only dimmed twice during my first week down here, and both times, the senior pilot told me to keep my eyes down and my mouth shut. He said there were things outside that didn't like attention. I assumed it was fear talking, or maybe some kind of hazing ritual, but sitting there now, I wondered whether he had been trying to protect me. When the depth gauge beeped to signal a minor shift in pressure, Marcus leaned forward and squinted at the window again. I tried to casually reach across the console to block his angle without making it obvious, but he noticed and smirked. He told me he didn't scare easily, and that if something was outside he wanted to see it. I swallowed hard and told him not to push his luck. He chuckled and said I sounded like the others, the ones who warned him during training that the rules were more than guidelines. I hated how he phrased it, like he was daring the trench to prove him wrong. Another slight tremor hummed through the cabin, and this time, Marcus stiffened. He turned toward the window again, but didn't look out. He just listened. I knew he sensed something too, even if he pretended he didn't believe in the stories. The hum felt wrong, like a deep vibration spreading through the sub from outside instead of inside. Marcus tried brushing it off by saying it must have been the stabilizers, but the stabilizers didn't make a vibration that felt like it came from the walls themselves. I told him to keep his eyes on the instruments and not the glass, and though he didn't respond, he didn't look up either. We drifted for another few minutes in complete silence, and I started to hope the worst had passed, but then the navigation lights picked up something in our path, a small irregular shape, suspended motionless. Marcus leaned in closer to the screen, murmuring that it wasn't marked on any charts. I zoomed the feed until the shape came into focus. It looked like a chunk of metal, maybe debris from an old research drone. I suggested steering around it, but Marcus insisted we check it out, saying it might be worth retrieving. I argued, but he was already adjusting the sub's angle, and the sudden turn made the cabin creak softly. As we drifted closer, the metal shape rotated slowly, as if pushed by a current we couldn't feel. My chest tightened when I recognized what it resembled. Not a drone, not debris, but something closer to a piece of a submersible hull. Marcus leaned toward the forward window as if trying to get a better look, and I reached for his arm again, gripping harder this time. He brushed me off, annoyed, saying he wasn't a child and knew better than to stare for more than a few seconds. But he didn't look away quickly enough, and I saw his expression freeze, his pupils widening in a way I'd never seen before. He whispered that he thought something was moving behind the metal fragment. Before I could reply, the shape shifted again, slowly enough that we both saw it at the same time. It wasn't debris at all, and as it turned fully toward us, I realized the face I had seen earlier wasn't a hallucination. It had been waiting. We were drifting along the jagged wall of the trench, when I remembered what the senior pilot had whispered during orientation. Rule 2. Never shine your beam at anything that moves on its own in the abyss. At the time, I didn't understand the gravity of it. But now, seeing something slither along the rock face, my hand itched to flick on the spotlight. The shape was ambiguous, part shadow, part distortion, but it moved with a precision that no current could explain. I had to force myself to look away, clenching my jaw as the sub hummed around us, the dim cabin lights doing nothing to dispel the growing unease. Marcus was staring at me, his face pale even in the cabin glow. "Did you see that?" he whispered, voice shaking. I didn't answer at first, because saying it aloud might summon it closer, might invite the thing to react to our attention. The rules didn't say anything about cameras or instruments, but instinct screamed that even recording it could be dangerous. The silence between us stretched taut, broken only by the soft creak of the sub's hull as it adjusted to the pressure. I forced my eyes downward toward the gauges, telling myself that as long as the instruments read normally, we were still safe. Yet every instinct in me screamed that safety was a lie. The shape drifted closer to the submersible, gliding past the dim outlines of the cliff wall like it was sliding along a path it had memorized. Marcus whispered again, this time urging me to light it up for better visibility. I shook my head violently, feeling the tension in my shoulders coil like a spring. No, I said quietly. You don't know what that is. Don't even think about it. He frowned, a mix of confusion and defiance flashing across his features. It was the same look I'd seen in trainees before. They couldn't understand that some boundaries weren't for proving courage, but for survival. I tried to focus on other tasks, checking thrusters, confirming pressure readings, reviewing the sonar logs, but nothing distracted me from the knowledge that whatever lurked outside had noticed our movement. It paused now and then, seemingly waiting for a signal, and I realized with a sickening certainty that the thing's awareness wasn't limited by distance or visibility. Marcus's hand hovered over the console, twitching slightly as he adjusted the brightness of the monitors, but I could tell he was itching to see it again. He didn't understand that the rule wasn't about superstition, it was about consequences, and consequences were closer than we wanted to admit. The sub drifted forward, following a mapped trench path, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was tracking us. It was moving with purpose, sliding along the ridges, and for the first time I saw the faintest hint of an outline that resembled a face, or what my mind wanted to recognize as a face. Marcus leaned closer to the window again, muttering under his breath, and I felt the old fear rise, that cold, paralyzing fear that told me he was about to break the rule. I told myself I couldn't stop him if he chose to, but I braced for the consequences anyway. They didn't give the rule numbers for fun. The pilots who ignored them didn't return to explain why. Suddenly the shape flickered, almost imperceptibly, like a distorted reflection in a funhouse mirror. Marcus froze and whispered something I didn't catch at first. My pulse accelerated as the object outside seemed to react to his voice, gliding slightly closer toward the sub's hull. The lights inside the cabin dimmed even further, shadows stretching unnaturally across the instruments. I gritted my teeth and reminded myself to keep calm, telling Marcus to remain seated and not to engage with it. Every instinct screamed otherwise, but I knew that even a brief glance, a single second of light, could trigger something beyond comprehension. I adjusted the sub's position to hug the trench wall more closely, hoping to create some physical separation between us and the unknown presence. Marcus kept stealing glances, and I finally spoke firmly. If you move or shine anything, you risk everything. Do you understand? His nod was hesitant, but I could see the struggle in his eyes. He wanted to challenge, to investigate, to prove that what I feared was only imagination. But this was different. Imagination didn't slide along metal and stone, didn't move in ways that defied physics, and it didn't wait with the patience of a predator. Minutes stretched into hours as we continued along the mapped path. The shape stayed just beyond the dim halo of the sub's hull lights, close enough to sense but never fully revealed. I found myself checking the gauges repeatedly, pretending the displays were more interesting than the abyss outside. Marcus stayed unnervingly quiet, a sign that he had finally understood, at least partially, the reason the rule existed. Still, I felt the weight of eyes on the sub, something that didn't need to see us to know we were aware of it. It was waiting, and I knew waiting was dangerous, because impatience often led to mistakes. Then the sonar flickered, displaying a small irregular form moving with impossible speed alongside the sub. Marcus gasped softly, and I could feel him tense beside me. I wanted to tell him to ignore it, but my own instincts pulled me toward the viewport. I resisted, keeping my hands tightly on the console. The rule repeated itself in my mind, not out loud, not mechanically, but as a cold truth we couldn't violate. Even thinking about shining a light at it made my skin crawl. We were drifting through a trench that no human had ever fully charted, and the shadows here were patient. They were deliberate. They remembered. A subtle tremor ran through the sub's frame, unlike anything caused by engines or minor currents. Marcus flinched and whispered, "It's coming closer." I wanted to argue, to tell him the readings didn't indicate any nearby objects, but something about the movement was wrong, unnatural, almost deliberate. The object outside didn't appear on any of the instruments, yet it was here, just as it had been before. I pressed myself back into the seat, telling myself that patience was survival, that obeying the rules was all that stood between us and an ending. I didn't want to imagine. The shadow twisted, rotating slowly, just enough for the faintest suggestion of a feature to appear. It wasn't human, but it was deliberate, aware, and possibly intelligent. Marcus' hands were trembling now, but he stayed seated, the lesson of the rules sinking in deeper than my words could explain. I realized we were being studied, that every flicker of motion, every twitch of our eyes, every breath we took was catalogued in that darkness. And as the sub drifted deeper into the trench, I knew our survival depended entirely on restraint, patience, and remembering that breaking this rule could have consequences far worse than anything we had ever faced before. Then the shape surged upward suddenly, faster than any current should allow, and it was close enough to distort the water around us. I felt the hull shiver as if the abyss itself had pressed against it, a silent warning that even the sub's metal couldn't keep the rules irrelevant. Marcus gasped again, frozen, and I could tell he wanted to run his hands across the window, to verify with his own eyes. I gripped the console tighter, forcing my voice out quietly, "Do not touch the lights. Do not move." His nod was stiff, but the tension in the cabin told me he knew we were no longer just observers. Something outside had taken notice of us, and I knew with an icy certainty that the rest of this dive would test every rule we had been given, and perhaps create a rule we didn't know yet. The sub trembled once more as the shadow receded slightly, retreating into the trench wall, but I knew it wasn't gone. Something in that darkness had acknowledged us, and whatever it was, it had decided we were worth watching. The moment I considered cracking the emergency hatch to get a better look at the trench wall, a cold memory slammed into me. Rule 3. Always keep the hull sealed unless absolutely necessary to exit or enter the submersible. That rule wasn't about fear. It was survival. I had almost pushed the lever without thinking, drawn by the faint, undulating shape that lingered just beyond the viewport. But the instinct to obey overrode curiosity. I could feel Marcus stiffen beside me, his gaze flicking toward the outer hull, and I knew he understood the weight of that single decision, even if he didn't understand the reason for it yet. The sub's hull creaked as we adjusted course, a subtle reminder that the pressure outside wasn't a suggestion, but a constant, crushing reality. Every joint and seam felt like it could betray us if we weren't careful, and the water beyond wasn't forgiving to human error. Marcus whispered something about wanting to test the outer sensor ports, but I shook my head sharply, gripping the console. "Not now," I said, voice tight. The rule wasn't arbitrary, it was a shield, and I wasn't willing to see what happened if it was ignored. We drifted deeper, the shadowy shape still trailing us along the jagged wall, its movements precise, almost playful in a way that made my stomach churn. I kept one hand on the pressure monitor and another near the emergency locks, unwilling to let curiosity outweigh caution. The deeper we went, the colder the sub felt, and the soft hum of the machinery couldn't mask the tension pressing into every corner. Marcus leaned closer to the side viewport, and I had to remind him to keep his distance, to remember why the hull existed, and why opening it uninvited was unthinkable. Every minor tremor of the sub sent my heart racing, because at this depth, even the smallest miscalculation could become fatal. I kept scanning the instruments, checking for leaks, pressure inconsistencies, anything that might hint the hull had been compromised. The shadow outside shifted suddenly, moving closer to the curvature of the sub. I held my breath, imagining the consequences. If the hull failed here, if a single breach allowed that thing a glimpse or a touch inside. Marcus's fingers hovered nervously over the controls, and I realized that despite knowing the rule, he still wanted to challenge it. Hours seemed to pass as we moved along the trench wall, with nothing but the oppressive dark surrounding us. The lights barely illuminated the immediate vicinity, and I resisted the urge to peer closer. Marcus finally spoke, voice barely audible. "Do you think it could get in if we cracked a hatch?" I swallowed hard, suppressing a shiver. I shook my head, telling him that even a tiny lapse could invite disaster. Every movement of the shadow reminded me why the rule existed, why no one in training had ever been allowed to touch an exterior panel without senior supervision. It wasn't superstition, it was survival. The shadow's movements became more deliberate, closer now, and I noticed how it seemed to align itself with the sub's curves, almost as if it could sense the seams in the metal. Marcus stared at me, eyes wide. I could tell he was thinking about the hatch again, but I gave him a look sharp enough to silence the thought. I couldn't afford mistakes, not when we were 7 miles beneath the ocean's surface, with a presence out there that might notice even the slightest lapse. Every rule we'd been taught now felt like a lifeline, and breaking this one could unravel everything. I adjusted the sub's depth slightly, glancing at the pressure gauges, while keeping one eye on the shadow. It reacted immediately, moving in tandem with the sub's slight roll. My heart hammered as I realized the entity was aware, not just of light, but of our physical movements. Marcus, noticing my tense posture, hesitated before speaking again. I could hear the unspoken question behind his lips. What if we opened a hatch? Just a crack? I didn't answer. The answer wasn't words. It was the cold certainty that some rules exist for reasons far beyond comprehension, and that breaking them could have consequences we wouldn't survive to see. The sub drifted along a ridge, following the faint contour lines mapped from older expeditions. I kept the hatch locked and checked every seal visually on the display panel. The shadow continued its silent surveillance, hovering just beyond the weak halo of our lights. Each passing second stretched longer than the last. I imagined the pressure outside as an invisible hand, ready to punish any foolish decision. Marcus's fingers brushed the edge of the console, testing the tension in his own restraint, and I silently prayed he'd keep his curiosity in check. Suddenly, the shadow made a movement I couldn't predict. It darted slightly beneath the sub, and for a heartbeat, I thought I saw the faintest outline pressing against the hull. The metal groaned under its invisible weight, and my pulse quickened. I tightened my grip on the controls and leaned back slightly, forcing Marcus to do the same. This was the kind of test the rule had been designed for. The temptation to intervene, to see what wasn't meant to be seen. And yet we survived simply by restraint, by leaving the hatch sealed, by trusting the warning engraved into memory. As the hours wore on, the shape began circling us more actively, almost taunting, testing the boundaries of our obedience. Marcus murmured a question about what would happen if we did open the hatch, but I cut him off. I reminded him that every action at this depth has a reaction far beyond our control, and the sub itself was the only thing separating us from the crushing water and the unknown intent outside. His gaze flicked to the shadow one more time, and I could see the internal battle, fear versus curiosity. I knew that the smallest lapse, the faintest desire to peek, could be our last. The sub drifted slowly along the mapped course, shadow outside maintaining its silent vigil, and I realized that the rule wasn't just about physical survival. It was about discipline, patience, and the courage to do nothing when every instinct screamed to act. I could feel Marcus relax slightly, knowing he wasn't the only one holding himself back. We both understood that the abyss doesn't reward recklessness, it only waits for mistakes. And as the shadow hovered just beyond the outer glass, I knew we were learning that lesson in real time, the weight of the trench pressing in from every angle. Then, without warning, the shadow shifted violently, rushing along the sub's curvature in a way that made the hull shiver under unseen pressure. Marcus yelped softly, gripping the console, and I felt my own stomach drop as if the sub itself recognized the danger. The instruments remained steady, but the movement was unmistakable. It wasn't leaving, it wasn't retreating, it was testing us, and I knew that next time, if we even thought about breaking the rule, the consequences would be immediate and we might not survive them. I felt a twinge of unease when the sonar began picking up faint pulses that seemed patterned, almost like a rhythm trying to form words, and immediately recalled the warning drilled into every new pilot. Rule 4. Never communicate with unknown signals outside the sub, no matter how faint or familiar they seem. My fingers hovered over the transmitter, tempted to respond just to see if we could understand what the pulses meant. But the memory of previous mistakes and vanished crew members kept me frozen. I whispered the rule to myself, letting it anchor my thoughts, as Marcus leaned forward, eyes wide with both curiosity and dread. The pulses repeated, subtle but persistent, drifting alongside our submersible, as if the shape outside was trying to convey something directly to us. Marcus muttered, "It almost sounds intentional." I swallowed hard and told him to keep quiet. The rule wasn't a suggestion. No one who ignored it came back to explain why. Every instinct screamed that replying, even mentally considering responding, could be the gravest mistake we'd make. Yet I couldn't stop the anxiety creeping through me, each rhythmic blip against the sonar feeling like a heartbeat counting down to something inevitable. We adjusted the sub's depth, hoping that changing our position might avoid the pulses or at least confuse their origin. But the signals followed us, bending around the cliff walls and lurking in every shadow the monitors displayed. Marcus tried to analyze the sequence, whispering numbers and guesses, but I told him to stop. This wasn't a puzzle, it wasn't a game. The deeper we went, the more apparent it became that the pulses weren't random. They were aware of us, adjusting themselves, testing our attention. I kept my hands on the console, trembling slightly as the sub swayed against currents. I couldn't feel, wondering if the entity outside was feeding off our reaction. The shadow from before moved closer, as if drawn to the sound of our debate, or perhaps the vibrations of our engines interacting with the signals. Its movement was deliberate, precise, and unnervingly patient. I could feel Marcus staring at me, urging silently for some kind of engagement, but I couldn't allow it. The rule existed because others had ignored it and paid the ultimate price. My mind flashed to those missing pilots, their faces etched with panic in the brief training videos we were shown, and I understood why communication, even passive acknowledgement, was forbidden. The trench didn't reward curiosity, it punished it. Hours passed, each sonar pulse resonating faintly against the metal of the hull. The shadow hovered nearby, occasionally gliding alongside the sub as if observing our restraint. I forced myself to concentrate on the depth gauges and thruster readings, pretending the pulses were nothing more than glitches in the system. Marcus kept glancing nervously at the monitors, and I reminded him quietly to focus on operation, not on what might be a message from the abyss. Every second spent contemplating response felt like tempting fate. Obeying the rule was the only thing keeping panic from overtaking logic. Suddenly the pattern changed, sharper now, almost a sequence that mimicked the rhythm of a human heartbeat. Marcus whispered, "Do you think it knows we're listening?" I didn't answer. The answer was obvious to anyone who had survived the depths. Yes, it knew. It knew we were aware, and it knew that the desire to respond was the weakest point in a human mind. I gripped the console harder, forcing myself to breathe, and stared at the monitors like a lifeline depended on it because it did. The pulses became more insistent, pressing against the hull like they could penetrate metal and bone alike. Yet I didn't move, obeying the rule with every ounce of will I had. I considered increasing distance to escape the signals, but any sudden shift could provoke the shadow. We were trapped between obeying the rule and navigating the sub through terrain that offered little margin for error. Marcus glanced at the external cameras again, but I signaled him to focus forward. There was no need for more distractions. The shadow's presence outside was enough to keep tension at a breaking point, and the faint rhythmic pulses were like a predator circling patiently. I reminded myself that this was why the rule existed, why each previous pilot had been warned, why even thinking about responding was a temptation that could be lethal. The pulses suddenly stopped, leaving an eerie silence that felt heavier than before. Marcus exhaled sharply, thinking we were safe, but I knew better. Silence in the abyss was rarely benign. The shadow lingered, waiting for any sign that we would break the rule. I adjusted our course slightly, maintaining our depth while keeping the hull sealed and all systems monitored. The sub hummed beneath us, and I could almost feel the entity pressing against the limits of the metal, testing for a mistake. Then the shadow darted closer to the forward window in a movement that made my stomach lurch. I froze, realizing that if we so much as thought about touching the controls or replying, the consequences could be immediate. Marcus's hand hovered near the console, and I caught his gaze, forcing a silent warning. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it alone, to keep obeying the rule that had saved countless others. The shadow paused as if sensing the restraint, and the silence stretched unbearably long, making my heart pound with every second. The sub drifted for another tense hour, moving silently along the trench wall. The shadow remained just beyond the halo of our dim lights, and the pulses seemed to linger in memory alone. I watched Marcus slowly calm, realizing that our survival depended on doing nothing. Yet despite the apparent stillness, I felt the weight of unseen attention pressing in, the kind that didn't require sound or movement to communicate intent. I understood that breaking Rule 4 could mean more than death. It could mean the abyss claiming us in ways we couldn't even imagine. Then, as we approached a narrow ridge, the shadow made a sudden movement upward, and for a moment I thought it had disappeared. But a faint pulse returned, faster, sharper, almost urgent. I realized we weren't just being observed anymore. Something wanted to see whether we would break the rule, and as the sub trembled slightly under unseen pressure, I knew that one mistake could be fatal. I felt a tightening in my chest as I glanced at Marcus fidgeting with the ventilation system, a habit he had when nervous, and immediately remembered the warning drilled into our minds during orientation. Rule 5. Never remove your helmet or face shield inside the submersible at extreme depths. At first it seemed like common sense, something that barely needed repeating, but after witnessing the shadow's persistent attention and the unknown pressures of the trench, I realized how literal the rule really was. I whispered it quietly to myself, letting it anchor my caution, while Marcus's eyes flicked toward the forward viewport, mesmerized by the faint outline of the dark shape lingering nearby. The sub hummed softly, the machinery doing its best to maintain pressure and life support. But even with everything operating perfectly, the thought of opening a helmet or loosening the seal made my skin crawl. Marcus shifted slightly, adjusting his oxygen supply as if testing whether a quick glance outside could justify removing the mask. I grabbed his arm firmly, shaking my head. "You know better," I hissed. At this depth, even a second of exposure could be fatal. His jaw tightened as he understood, but I could see the temptation in his eyes, the pull of curiosity versus survival instincts. This rule wasn't theoretical, it was written in the lives of every diver who'd ignored it. The shadow seemed to notice the tension inside the cabin. It moved again, slow and deliberate, gliding just beyond the dim glow of the sub's lights, as though aware of every twitch, every thought of disobedience. Marcus's hand hovered near the ventilation panel, fingers itching to touch, to experiment, but I placed my hand over his wrist. "Don't even think about it," I muttered. The shadow's presence made the cabin feel smaller, the metal walls pressing in as if they too feared a breach in our discipline. I focused on the console readings, reassuring myself that as long as the hull stayed sealed and the helmets locked, the sub was our shield and our only lifeline. Every creak of the sub made me flinch, reminding me that even with all systems nominal, the trench could turn against us without warning. The shadow shifted again, moving beneath the sub, and I could see Marcus's gaze follow it like a magnet, drawn toward the unknown despite the warnings. I reminded him quietly, almost pleadingly, about Rule 5, telling him we couldn't risk anything that compromised the seals or helmets. He nodded stiffly, but the tension in his posture told me he was fighting the urge to test the rule. The shadow lingered, patient and intelligent, aware of every hesitation, every flicker of desire to disobey. I took a deep breath, focusing on our planned route through the trench, trying to push the shape out of my mind while keeping the sub steady. The shadow wasn't moving aggressively, it wasn't yet, but its constant presence reminded me that the abyss didn't tolerate lapses. Marcus shifted again, whispering about the pressure and how it felt almost tangible. I told him that sensations could be misleading, and that obeying the rule was more important than understanding every strange feeling. If we broke Rule 5, the consequences would be immediate, brutal, and unavoidable. Hours dragged on, the shadow remaining just beyond the halo of the sub's lights, moving in patterns that were deliberate yet impossible to read fully. I monitored every gauge, every system, making sure the hull's integrity was unbroken. Marcus, despite his fascination, refrained from touching any emergency seals or attempting to adjust his helmet. I could feel the weight of restraint pressing on both of us. The shadow seemed to circle the sub, observing silently, almost testing our discipline, aware that a single lapse could provide an opening. I realized that Rule 5 wasn't about protecting the human body alone, it was about preventing the abyss from having even the smallest chance to exploit weakness. Then the shadow made a sudden shift, surging upward along the hull with a speed that defied the currents we felt. Marcus gasped, gripping the console instinctively, and I could see the tension radiate through his frame. I held my ground, my eyes fixed on the instruments and not the viewport, reminding myself that the rule existed because a single mistake here could cost us our lives. The sub trembled slightly under the pressure, though the gauges remained steady, a subtle warning that even obedience didn't guarantee comfort. The shadow had tested us again, and I knew that next time, it might test us even more severely. Minutes later, the shape lingered close to the forward window, almost brushing against the sub's surface. Marcus shivered and muttered something about wanting to peek, but I shot him a sharp glance, my voice low and firm. Not a chance. Rule 5 exists for a reason. He nodded, swallowing hard, finally understanding that curiosity here wasn't merely dangerous, it was deadly. The sub continued its silent drift, every creak and vibration a reminder that the trench didn't care about human logic or fear. And in that moment I realized that our survival depended not just on following the rules mechanically, but on controlling every fleeting thought of breaking them. As we edged deeper into the trench, the shadow moved with deliberate patience, staying just outside the halo of our lights. Marcus avoided the forward window, and I could see him struggling with the same temptation I fought every second. The sub seemed to shrink around us, the metal walls compressing under the weight of the abyss and the intelligent presence outside. I focused on the instruments, breathing slowly, letting the rhythm of the sub's life support soothe my racing heart. Every instinct screamed that this was exactly why Rule 5 had been written into the pilot manuals. It wasn't a guideline. It was the difference between life and instant death. Then, without warning, the shadow surged upward once more, closer than it had ever been before, its movements calculated and precise. Marcus gripped the console as the hull shivered, and I realized that any lapse, any hesitation, could trigger something we couldn't survive. I leaned back, holding myself and him firmly to the seats, knowing that the next moment would define whether we continued breathing or became just another cautionary tale of the trench. The shadow hovered, intelligent and patient, testing boundaries as if aware of every rule we had ever been taught and every thought we hadn't yet acted upon. The first time I saw a faint glint, reflecting from the trench wall, I immediately remembered the warning ingrained in every pilot's memory. Rule 6. Never touch or interact with any unknown object or debris outside the submersible. The shape seemed harmless at first, a piece of metal or rock perhaps, but the moment I considered extending the manipulator arm, my instincts screamed at me to stop. Marcus leaned forward, curiosity burning in his eyes, but I gripped his shoulder lightly, forcing him back. This wasn't about hesitation. It was about survival, and the trench didn't forgive mistakes. The object hovered in the shadows, shifting slightly with the faint currents, and I realized it had a presence, an intent that made my skin crawl. Marcus whispered that it looked like it had been placed there, almost waiting, but I told him to stop imagining things. The rules weren't for theatrics. They were written after the disappearance of crews who had interacted with the trench's anomalies. Every subtle movement of the object sent a shiver through me, reminding me that what we were dealing with wasn't predictable, and the slightest contact could trigger consequences beyond comprehension. We adjusted our position to drift slightly away from the wall, keeping the manipulator arms tucked safely inside the submersible. The shadow lingered nearby, moving in silent arcs that seemed to monitor us, almost as if it knew we were aware of the object. Marcus's gaze flicked between the debris and the monitor, temptation written plainly on his face. I reminded him in a low voice that the rule existed because even a minor touch could be catastrophic. The trench had a memory, a reaction to contact, and anyone who disregarded it paid a price we were fortunate enough to have survived by following the previous rules. Minutes passed, and the object's subtle movements seemed synchronized with the shadow outside, a coordination that made my stomach knot. I felt every vibration in the sub, every hum of machinery, as though the sub itself was aware of the threat. Marcus swallowed nervously, and I could see the hesitation in him, an internal battle between curiosity and caution. I focused on the depth gauges, keeping my attention on the technical side of piloting while ignoring the pull of fascination outside. This was why Rule 6 existed, not because the objects were inherently dangerous, but because interacting with them could draw attention from forces far beyond comprehension. Then the object shifted slightly, almost gliding along the trench wall toward a narrow crevice. The shadow moved in tandem, and for a terrifying moment, I felt as though the two were communicating, or worse, baiting us. I gripped the console tighter, forcing Marcus to focus on the instruments rather than the viewport. The rule wasn't just guidance, it was a lifeline. Breaking it could result in something attaching to the hull, entering the sub, or drawing the shadow closer in ways we couldn't survive. I reminded myself silently, never touch, never interact, and keep moving. The sub drifted carefully along the wall, avoiding any sudden movements that might disturb the object. Marcus's hands hovered nervously near the manipulator controls, and I caught him just in time before he tried to extend them. I gave him a sharp glance, and his lips pressed into a thin line, realizing that even a minor lapse could be fatal. The shadow outside remained patient, circling in patterns that were almost taunting, testing the limits of our restraint. I focused on the instruments, pretending the object and the watching presence didn't exist, knowing full well that this discipline was what would keep us alive. Hours seemed to stretch endlessly as the sub continued its slow, deliberate course. The object remained in view, unmoving now, but I could feel its significance. Even without touching it, it demanded our attention, and I could sense Marcus struggling to resist the urge to investigate. I reminded him quietly that this was exactly the scenario the rule was meant for, that temptation itself was the trap. The shadow remained nearby, almost hovering, as if it were ensuring that no pilot would dare disobey. Every fiber of my being was on high alert, knowing that the abyss did not forgive mistakes and had a memory for every infraction. Suddenly the shadow darted closer to the object, pushing it slightly toward the sub, and I felt my pulse spike. Marcus froze, eyes wide, and I realized that the entity outside was testing us, probing to see if we would break the rule. I tightened my grip on the console and leaned back slightly, forcing Marcus to do the same. The sub trembled subtly, though the gauges remained steady, a silent reminder that the trench itself was watching our every move. Following Rule 6 was no longer about caution, it was about survival under the constant observation of something patient, intelligent, and merciless. The shadow drifted away slightly, leaving the object hovering alone against the trench wall. My hands shook with tension, and I could see Marcus exhaling, trying to regain control of his nerves. I reminded myself that restraint was the only thing keeping the sub intact, that interacting with the object, even once, could have catastrophic consequences. The shadow lingered, waiting for us to make a mistake, and I realized that this entire encounter wasn't just about the object or even the shadow. It was about testing our discipline, our ability to follow the rules under extreme pressure. One wrong move, and the abyss would claim us. Then, without warning, the shadow surged closer again, pressing against the sub's outer surface with a sudden intensity that made the hull tremble. Marcus gripped the console, eyes wide with panic, and I felt my stomach drop. I knew this was a test of patience and adherence. Any interaction with the unknown object would have immediate consequences. The shadow seemed to linger deliberately, measuring, waiting, as if it knew that curiosity could override caution in a heartbeat. I could only brace myself and Marcus for what might come next, knowing we were walking a razor's edge of survival. I noticed the gauge twitch slightly, a subtle fluctuation that almost seemed insignificant, but immediately the warning came back to me. Rule 7. Never ignore changes in the submersible's pressure readings, no matter how minor they seem. At first glance, it was easy to dismiss, a quirk of the instruments or a momentary electrical hiccup, yet my gut screamed otherwise. Marcus was busy studying the shadow outside, mesmerized by its deliberate movements, and I realized how dangerous it was to split attention when every second mattered. One tiny oversight could compromise everything, and the abyss would not forgive mistakes. The sub's walls groaned faintly as I adjusted the ballast slightly, trying to compensate for the subtle pressure shift. The shadow remained patient outside, gliding along the trench wall, and I could feel it observing us, aware of even the smallest human error. Marcus noticed the gauge twitch too, but he hesitated, eyes flicking toward the dark form outside. Instead of helping interpret the readings, I forced myself to focus, reminding him quietly that ignoring the changes could be fatal. At this depth, the difference between stability and catastrophe was measured in tiny increments, often undetectable until it was far too late. We moved along a narrow ridge, the trench walls pressing in like the abyss itself was closing around us. The sub's instruments continued their delicate hum, occasionally flicking with tiny variations that set my nerves on edge. Marcus tried to argue that it was normal fluctuation, but I shut him down firmly, knowing that at this depth, nothing was normal. The shadow seemed to sense our tension, approaching closer in deliberate arcs, testing our reaction. I could feel my hands trembling slightly over the controls, conscious that the faintest error in judgment could send us spiraling into the darkness outside. Minutes turned into a torturous stretch of time as I tracked each gauge, recalibrated the sensors, and monitored the ballast. The shadow moved subtly closer, almost caressing the hull with its unseen presence, as if it wanted us to panic or make a mistake. I reminded myself that obeying Rule 7 wasn't just about reading numbers, it was about staying calm, alert, and disciplined, when every instinct screamed to ignore the small warnings and focus on the fear pressing against the sub's walls. Marcus's hand hovered near the console, trembling as he resisted reaching for the instruments without my guidance. Suddenly, the pressure readings spiked just slightly, a subtle but unmistakable deviation. The sub trembled lightly, the instruments registering the shift in a way that seemed amplified by the surrounding darkness. Marcus gasped softly, and I gritted my teeth, adjusting the ballast to stabilize us. I knew instantly that ignoring even this minor change could escalate into a dangerous situation within minutes. The shadow outside reacted, moving with a speed and precision that made my stomach knot. It wasn't the sub's fault, it was ours, if we failed to heed the warning. I double-checked all systems, confirming that every seal was intact, every gauge recalibrated, and every thruster balanced. The shadow shifted along the trench wall, observing, almost predatory in its patience. I could see Marcus gripping his seat, jaw tight, the lesson of vigilance sinking in deeper than any fear we had felt before. Obeying the rule was no longer theoretical, it was the only thing keeping the sub intact, and us alive. Every slight fluctuation became a potential threat, every moment a test of our discipline. The shadow's movements grew more deliberate, gliding close to areas of the hull that seemed vulnerable, as if it could sense the subtle tremors of pressure. Marcus whispered that he had never felt anything like this, and I reminded him to stay focused on the instruments. Even a tiny lapse could escalate into catastrophe. The abyss was patient, but it wasn't forgiving. Each small change in pressure carried consequences far beyond what the gauges could quantify, and the shadow seemed to know exactly how much we could tolerate. Hours dragged on, with the sub maintaining a tense, delicate balance. Every minor deviation in the readings had to be corrected instantly, every movement measured and precise. The shadow hovered nearby, close enough to feel its intent, testing whether we would falter under pressure, literally and figuratively. I could feel the tension coiling in Marcus, but he finally accepted that the sub's survival, and ours, depended entirely on obeying Rule 7. This wasn't about bravery or curiosity, it was about following protocol to survive. Suddenly, a sharp but brief spike jolted the pressure gauge, enough to make the sub shiver in response. Marcus's eyes widened, and I could see the panic rising, but I forced myself to stay calm. The shadow reacted immediately, rushing along the hull in a blur that made the sub tremble again. I tightened my grip, holding Marcus steady, and reminded him silently that one more lapse, one hesitation, could mean disaster. The abyss was testing us, gauging our reaction, and I knew it would not wait patiently forever. The shadow's patience was infinite. Our margin for error was not. I felt my pulse quicken as the sub's emergency indicator flickered faintly, a reminder of everything that could go wrong at this depth. And immediately I remembered Rule 8. Never attempt to open the emergency escape hatch without authorization. The warning wasn't just about protocol, it was about survival. A second of impatience, a split-second decision driven by panic, could have catastrophic consequences. Marcus, still shaken from the shadow's relentless presence, glanced toward the hatch with a mix of fear and curiosity, and I could see the temptation in his eyes, the same temptation that had ended the careers of many pilots before us. The sub hummed quietly as I monitored every system, resisting the instinct to check the hatch myself. The shadow glided outside, hovering near the forward viewport, seemingly aware of our thoughts and reactions. I reminded Marcus quietly that opening the hatch without authorization was not an option, and that even considering it could provoke the abyss. His hand twitched toward the latch, but I caught it with a firm grip, locking eyes with him. We both knew the rule existed, because the abyss could exploit even the smallest misstep, and our survival depended on discipline above all else. We drifted along the trench wall, the shadow moving in deliberate patterns that made every moment feel like a test. Marcus whispered something about a previous crew's escape procedure, but I interrupted, reminding him that speculation could lead to disaster. The faint hum of the instruments filled the cabin as I monitored the emergency systems, aware that even a minor miscalculation with the hatch could trigger water intrusion or alert the entity outside. The shadow's presence seemed to amplify every minor noise, every shift in pressure, making the sub feel smaller, more fragile, and more alive than it ever had before. Minutes passed, and the shadow circled closer to the rear of the sub, near the emergency hatch. Its movements were deliberate, almost predatory, as if it were testing whether we could maintain restraint under pressure. Marcus exhaled shakily, hand still near the console, and I reminded him silently of Rule 8, emphasizing that our survival was tied directly to obedience. The hatch itself, gleaming faintly under the cabin lights, became a symbol of temptation and danger. I could feel every muscle in my body tense as we navigated the trench, knowing that even the smallest action could have deadly consequences. The shadow's movements grew faster, sweeping along the hull in short bursts, creating subtle vibrations that made the sub tremble slightly. I kept my hands tightly on the console, forcing Marcus to maintain the same vigilance. I reminded him quietly to focus on piloting, not the temptation of the hatch, because even touching it without authorization could be fatal. The sub shifted gently with the currents, and I could feel the weight of the abyss pressing in from all sides. Obeying Rule 8 wasn't just about following procedure, it was about surviving an environment that didn't forgive mistakes. Hours passed, with the sub continuing its slow, deliberate drift. The shadow remained outside, gliding along the trench wall, its presence constant and patient. Marcus's hands twitched occasionally, a silent struggle against the compulsion to check the hatch, but he finally relaxed slightly, understanding that our lives depended on discipline. I focused on the instruments, monitoring depth, pressure, and hull integrity, knowing that the shadow could sense even the smallest lapse in concentration. Rule 8 wasn't merely a guideline, it was a lifeline, and the abyss was testing our adherence. Suddenly, a subtle vibration ran along the sub's frame, originating near the emergency hatch. The shadow surged closer, brushing against the outer hull, and I felt the tension spike in the cabin. Marcus's eyes widened, and I knew he was tempted to act, to test the hatch, to see what might happen. I gritted my teeth and held his gaze, silently reinforcing the rule: no action, no curiosity, no mistakes. The shadow lingered, almost mocking, as if aware of the internal struggle we faced, and I understood that the next decision could define whether we survived the dive. The sub trembled again as the shadow pressed lightly against the hull, focusing on the area around the emergency hatch. Marcus gasped softly, hand frozen midair, and I reminded myself that even thinking about bypassing the rule was dangerous. The abyss doesn't reward bravery, it only punishes recklessness. I gripped the console tightly, feeling every creak and vibration as though the sub itself were warning me. Rule 8 existed to protect us, and obedience was the only thing standing between life and disaster. The shadow shifted, circling the hull in unpredictable arcs, yet always returning to the hatch. Marcus's breathing grew shallow, and I could sense him fighting the urge to act. I leaned back, maintaining a firm grip on the controls, silently urging patience and restraint. Every instinct screamed that opening the hatch, even a crack, would trigger an immediate and potentially fatal response. The shadow waited, intelligent, patient, and relentless, as though it had all the time in the world to test the limits of our discipline. Then, without warning, the shadow surged once more along the hull near the hatch, making the sub tremble sharply. Marcus froze completely, eyes wide with terror, and I could feel my own heart pounding. I knew the test wasn't over, that the abyss had far more patience than we could imagine, and that one false move could cost us everything. The sub held firm, instruments stable, but the shadow's intent was unmistakable. Obedience to Rule 8 wasn't just protocol, it was the only thing keeping us alive. The sub's dim lights illuminated a jagged ridge ahead, and I noticed subtle, unnatural formations embedded in the trench wall, prompting an immediate reminder. Rule 9. Always document every anomaly you encounter, but never attempt to study it directly. My fingers hovered over the recording system, capturing every shadow and ripple without hesitation. Marcus's eyes darted toward the strange patterns, fascination battling caution. I gripped his shoulder lightly, silently reinforcing the importance of distance. Curiosity could kill us in moments, and obeying the rule meant preserving our lives, not indulging in what the abyss presented. The shadow hovered nearby, as though aware of our documentation, its movements deliberate and measured. I recorded the ridge meticulously, panning cameras slowly, ensuring every detail was captured for analysis later. Marcus whispered, almost reverently, about the intricate shapes and patterns, but I reminded him quietly that study could wait. Direct interaction would be catastrophic. The sub hummed softly as we continued, the instruments steady but every vibration amplified by the silence surrounding us. The abyss was patient, and I understood that our survival hinged on restraint as much as on our technical skills. Minutes passed, each frame captured a testament to the eerie beauty and danger surrounding us. The shadow moved along the trench, circling closer but never touching, as if monitoring our adherence to the rules. Marcus struggled to resist leaning forward, attempting to get a better view, but I placed a hand on his arm, ensuring he stayed at a safe distance. Documenting anomalies was one thing, touching, experimenting, or interacting was another entirely. Every second spent obeying the rule felt like a shield, every glance away from the monitor, a test of discipline against the dark curiosity of the unknown. The ridge twisted and turned, revealing more strange formations, some resembling elongated shapes that defied natural logic. I kept the cameras rolling, making sure the data was as detailed as possible without breaching the safety protocols. Marcus exhaled shakily, realizing the rule existed not just to protect the submersible, but to protect us from consequences that could strike in ways we couldn't predict. The shadow's presence outside made every small twitch of the controls feel monumental, every adjustment a test of resolve. I reminded myself silently that breaking Rule 9 wasn't a risk we could afford. Hours dragged on as we carefully maneuvered along the trench, documenting anomalies while avoiding any temptation to interact. The shadow followed our movements, always patient, always observing, almost as if it knew the precise boundaries of human restraint. Marcus glanced at the monitors repeatedly, tempted to zoom in closer, but I gave him a firm, warning look. Every frame captured was a safeguard. Every act of restraint reinforced the fragile barrier between survival and disaster. The abyss didn't need to act. It simply waited for mistakes. Suddenly, one anomaly appeared to shift subtly, almost imperceptibly, beneath the soft halo of our lights. I froze, knowing that even recording it could provoke a reaction if handled carelessly. Marcus's hand hovered near the zoom controls, and I gripped his wrist firmly. The shadow responded immediately, moving with precise speed along the sub's hull, testing our focus and discipline. Rule 9 wasn't simply about documentation. It was about ensuring that the unknown remained observed, not engaged, and that our survival didn't depend on curiosity. The sub trembled faintly as we continued recording, every vibration magnified by the oppressive pressure outside. I adjusted the lights to avoid unnecessary glare while keeping every anomaly in view. Marcus whispered that it felt alive, but I reminded him that human perception was flawed at this depth. What mattered was adherence to the rule. The shadow's slow, deliberate movements kept our adrenaline high, yet I forced myself to focus entirely on the instruments and recording, knowing that even a fraction of hesitation could invite disaster. Documenting without interaction was a tightrope, and one misstep could be fatal. Hours turned into what felt like days, the trench revealing more anomalies with each passing moment. The shadow remained vigilant, circling the sub in a pattern that seemed designed to test our discipline. Marcus struggled with the compulsion to study closely, but I reminded him silently that obedience was the only thing keeping us alive. Each anomaly documented safely reinforced the delicate balance between survival and catastrophe. The abyss, patient and watchful, tested us relentlessly, gauging whether human curiosity would override caution. Then, without warning, one anomaly shifted sharply, moving toward the sub as if alive, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Marcus froze mid-motion, eyes wide with fear, and I instinctively tightened my grip on the controls. The shadow surged in response, pressing closer to the sub's hull in a silent but unmistakable warning. I realized that Rule 9 wasn't just about observation, it was about acknowledging the intelligence around us and respecting boundaries we couldn't afford to cross. One wrong movement could end everything in seconds. The sub's depth gauge ticked steadily, but the thought of going even a few meters lower made my pulse spike. I immediately remembered Rule 10, never descend below the planned depth without authorization. The abyss wasn't forgiving, and the Mariana Trench below had claimed countless lives for the smallest miscalculations. Marcus glanced at me nervously, clearly tempted by the shadow lingering beyond the forward viewport, and I had to remind him that obedience wasn't optional. Going deeper wasn't just reckless, it was suicidal. A fact proven by the empty space and silence that swallowed anyone who ignored the warning. The shadow moved closer to the sub, gliding deliberately along the trench wall as if testing whether we'd obey. Every fiber of my being screamed to maintain course, to keep the depth locked, and I reminded Marcus quietly to focus on the instruments, rather than the dark spectacle outside. One slight deviation could cause pressure failures, structural collapse, or draw the shadow's attention in ways we couldn't predict. Obeying Rule 10 was about more than discipline. It was about trusting the boundary that kept us alive and respecting the abyss's lethal patience. As we navigated a narrow canyon, the currents tugged subtly at the hull, and I had to adjust our ballast carefully. The shadow followed our movements with uncanny precision, always staying just beyond the glow of our lights, almost as if it knew exactly how far we might push. Marcus's hand twitched toward the depth controls, curiosity battling caution, and I caught his gaze with a warning look. This was not a moment for experimentation. Every slight increase in depth could escalate risk exponentially, and the trench didn't need to do more than wait for us to falter. Minutes stretched into hours as we slowly maneuvered along the canyon floor, the sub's systems humming steadily. The shadow mirrored our movements, never leaving our side, a silent observer of our restraint. Marcus whispered about what might exist below us, strange creatures or debris, and I reminded him that imagination was dangerous at this depth. Following the rule wasn't just about obedience. It was about respecting the invisible boundary that separated life from the unknown. Any unauthorized descent could be the moment the abyss decided we were no longer worth sparing. The sub hummed as I monitored depth, pressure, and ballast, each minor adjustment a test of precision. The shadow drifted closer to the lower canyon walls, subtly altering its trajectory in response to our movements. I felt a tightening in my chest, realizing that even the thought of going lower could provoke consequences. Marcus shivered and glanced at me, and I silently reinforced the rule. Staying at the planned depth wasn't a limitation, it was our lifeline. The abyss was intelligent, and the shadow's deliberate movements reminded us that curiosity could be fatal. Suddenly, a faint vibration ran through the hull, subtle but enough to make my pulse race. The shadow surged slightly, circling beneath the sub as if measuring the integrity of the metal and our adherence to the rule. Marcus's hand twitched toward the depth lever, but I grabbed it firmly, holding him in check. Obeying Rule 10 wasn't about discipline, it was survival. The abyss would exploit the slightest hesitation, the smallest curiosity, and the shadow made it painfully clear that it understood human weakness better than we did. Hours passed in tense silence, every minor shift in ballast, every tiny fluctuation in depth amplified by the oppressive darkness outside. The shadow remained close, gliding along the hull, patient yet assertive in its presence. I reminded Marcus to stay focused on the instruments, resisting the allure of exploring beyond our authorized depth. Every decision mattered, every temptation resisted reinforced the fragile line between life and annihilation. The trench didn't punish mistakes immediately, it waited, patient and deadly, for the moment we slipped. The shadow shifted again, pressing near the sub's lower hull in a slow, deliberate manner. Marcus swallowed hard, clearly feeling the pressure, and I forced myself to focus on monitoring systems instead of the external terror. Rule 10 existed for a reason. The Mariana Trench below was a world that didn't forgive mistakes, and the deeper we went without permission, the higher the stakes became. One wrong movement, one lapse in focus, and the abyss would decide our fate in an instant. Suddenly, the sub shivered under a minor unexpected current, the depth gauge flickering in response. The shadow reacted immediately, moving faster along the hull in a testing motion. Marcus froze, hand hovering near the controls, and I tightened my grip on the console. Even the smallest temptation to descend further could end everything. The shadow lingered, intelligent and patient, as if waiting for us to challenge the boundary we were not allowed to cross. Obeying Rule 10 was no longer a choice. It was a matter of life and death. The sub's lights flickered slightly, as an eerie resonance traveled through the hull, making my chest tighten instantly, and I remembered the final warning. Rule 11. Never communicate with or respond to any voices or signals from the deep, unless instructed. At first, it was just a whisper, almost drowned out by the hum of the life support systems, but soon it became a pattern, a deliberate cadence that seemed to mimic our own movements. Marcus stiffened, his eyes wide, and I gripped his arm, reminding him silently that responding in any way could doom us. The abyss didn't need to reach through the hull. It already had a presence, patient and intelligent, waiting for a breach in our obedience. The shadow outside shifted closer, its movement synchronized almost perfectly with the faint signals penetrating the cabin. I avoided looking at the forward viewport directly, instead focusing on the console, aware that even acknowledging the voice could be fatal. Marcus whispered, "Did you hear that?" And I shook my head subtly, knowing that confirming or reacting was exactly what the rule warned against. The signal seemed to learn, adjusting tempo and pitch in response to our movements. Every instinct screamed to answer, to investigate, but survival depended entirely on restraint. Minutes passed, each faint pulse or hum from the deep sending shivers down my spine. The sub's instruments remained steady, but I could feel the intelligence beyond the hull, measuring our reactions, testing the boundaries of our discipline. Marcus's hand twitched near the communication panel, and I caught it firmly, my grip an unspoken command: obey the rule. Responding was not a question of bravery. It was a question of life and death. Rule 11 existed because the abyss had a voice subtle and insidious, and it would exploit the slightest lapse without mercy. The shadow outside began moving in slow, deliberate arcs, almost as if guiding the signals toward us. The cadence of the deep's hum grew more distinct, like a language we couldn't comprehend, yet it carried intent. Marcus whispered nervously that it sounded like someone was calling his name, and I forced myself to keep my focus on the instrumentation. Ignoring it was harder than anything I'd faced in the trench. The abyss didn't shout, it enticed, and that temptation was exactly what Rule 11 was designed to prevent. Hours stretched on, the hums and signals increasing in intensity, each pulse seemingly responding to our tiniest adjustments in ballast and course. The shadow drifted closer, gliding along the hull, and I could feel its awareness pressing in on us, observing, judging, waiting. Marcus trembled, whispering again, "Maybe we should answer," but I shook my head sharply, my eyes locked on the gauges. Every instinct screamed compliance. Responding could open a channel we could never close, and I knew that the abyss could manipulate that, using the very voice of fear against us. The sub trembled slightly as another pattern emerged in the deep signals, almost melodic yet entirely alien. I gripped the console, forcing Marcus to remain silent, aware that the sub's integrity and our survival depended on ignoring it completely. The shadow's movements became more aggressive, brushing closer along the outer hull, as if urging us to fail. I could sense intelligence in the timing, a test of willpower that made the air feel impossibly thick. Any response would be fatal, yet the human instinct to acknowledge a voice calling your name pressed against every rule I had followed for hours. Suddenly, the signals harmonized into something unmistakably rhythmic, almost like words, carrying a subtle, hypnotic cadence that made my head spin. Marcus's eyes darted between me and the viewport, struggling to resist, and I reminded him silently of Rule 11. The abyss wasn't asking, it was manipulating. Our silence was our only protection. Every heartbeat felt amplified, every sound from the deep resonating through the hull, a reminder that we were not alone, that we had never been alone. The shadow hovered closer, gliding like a predator that knew the rules as well as we did. Minutes dragged into what felt like endless hours, and I realized that following Rule 11 wasn't simply a command. It was the final shield against a presence that could bend the abyss to its will. Marcus swallowed nervously, eyes fixed on the console, and I could see the internal struggle tearing at him. Every pulse, every signal from the deep was designed to make us react, to break us, and yet restraint remained the only lifeline. The shadow's pressure against the hull was heavier now, closer, reminding me that it had all the time in the world, and so did the abyss it represented. Then, without warning, the signal stopped, plunging the cabin into a tense, hollow silence. The shadow lingered along the forward hull, patient, as if it had tested us fully, and was deciding whether we were worthy of continuing. Marcus exhaled shakily, gripping the console, and I realized that we had survived by a hair's breadth. But the absence of sound was not reassurance. It was an invitation, a pause before something else, something worse. The abyss had learned our discipline, our obedience, and it was waiting for the moment we slipped, patient as always. And in that silence, I knew with a bone-deep certainty that the Mariana Trench held more than shadows and pressure. It held something that didn't forgive, something that remembered, something that waited. Following Rule 11 had kept us alive for now, but even now, in the quiet, I could feel a whisper crawling across the hull, just below perception, promising that the rules were never over, and survival was never guaranteed.